The Midnight Rain. The story starts with Priya, a young woman who moved to a new town for work. It was monsoon season, and heavy rains had been pouring for days, adding a sense of unease to her first nights in her new apartment. The rain seemed to bring a strange energy to the town, and locals warned her not to venture out at night, especially when it rained. One night, as she lay in bed listening to the rain, she heard faint crying outside her window. Startled, she tried to ignore it, but the crying grew louder and more desperate. Unable to sleep, she looked out her window, but the narrow street was empty. Yet the crying continued, as if a woman was sobbing right outside. She wondered if it could be a stray dog or a trick of the wind. The crying stopped abruptly, leaving an eerie silence. She told herself it was just her imagination, but she couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching her. The next morning, Priya asked her neighbor, an elderly woman, if she had heard anything strange. The woman hesitated and then warned her about an urban legend, a woman who supposedly roams the streets on rainy nights, looking for her lost child. Legend had it that if you heard her crying, you must never look for her. Those who did were said to disappear without a trace. Dismissing the story as mere superstition, Priya went about her day. But that night, when the rains returned, so did the crying, louder this time and closer. Unable to contain her curiosity, Priya opened her window and looked down into the street. She saw a woman in white, drenched, standing directly below her window. The woman looked up, her face pale and drenched in shadows. Her eyes met Priya's, hollow and sorrowful, and Priya felt an overwhelming sense of dread. She quickly shut the window, her heart racing. That night, Priya couldn't sleep. She felt cold, as if the rain had seeped into her bones. The following day, she found wet footprints leading from her door to her bedroom window, even though she hadn't let anyone in. She began hearing voices, whispers calling her name when she was alone, and seeing shadows moving in her apartment. Each time the rain returned, the crying would grow louder and more desperate. She knew she should leave, but something held her there, almost as if the crying woman didn't want her to go. Days turned into weeks, and Priya grew increasingly exhausted, barely sleeping, haunted by the phantom woman's cries. In desperation, she spoke with the elderly neighbor again, who confessed a terrible truth. Many years ago, a young mother had drowned herself and her child during a storm after being abandoned. Ever since, she'd been seen by those who were destined to join her. On a particularly stormy night, Priya's curiosity got the best of her. She decided to go down to the street, hoping to put the woman's spirit to rest. Armed with nothing but a flashlight, she stepped out into the rain. The crying surrounded her, echoing from all directions, making it hard to pinpoint its source. She felt hands tugging at her clothes, as if trying to pull her back, but she pressed on. At the end of the street, she saw her, the woman in white, holding something in her arms, her back turned. Priya felt compelled to approach, her feet moving against her will. As she drew closer, she realized the woman was holding a bundle wrapped in wet cloth. The woman slowly turned, revealing a horrifying, decayed face. In her arms lay not a child, but a bundle of rags soaked in mud. As Priya screamed, the woman vanished, leaving Priya alone in the rain, clutching the empty bundle. The last thing Priya heard was a soft whisper, "Now you are mine." The next morning, the neighbor found Priya's apartment empty. All that remained was a trail of wet footprints leading out into the rain. As days passed, Priya's life spiraled further into a nightmare. She tried to brush off the memory of that night as a hallucination, a product of exhaustion, but things only grew worse. Every time it rained, she felt as if the woman in white was right there with her, lingering in her room, watching from the shadows. She would catch glimpses of her out of the corner of her eye, reflections in the glass, a shadow in the mirror, or a faint figure just beyond her window. But when she looked directly, there was no one there. One night, during another relentless rainstorm, Priya received a call from her mother, who immediately sensed something was wrong. Priya hesitated, unsure how to explain the haunting that had plagued her for weeks. But just as she began to confide in her mother, her phone began to emit a strange static, cutting off her mother's voice. In the background, she heard faint sobbing, just like the woman's. Suddenly, the static grew louder, distorting her mother's voice into a hollow, distorted moan. Priya, come with me, panicked. She threw the phone down, her heart racing as she heard footsteps approaching her front door. The doorknob slowly twisted, and a cold draft blew through the room, extinguishing the candle she had lit for comfort. In the darkness, she felt an icy hand graze her arm. Gasping, she turned, but saw nothing. Unable to take it any longer, Priya rushed to the temple the next morning, desperate for answers. She sought out a priest, an older man with a deep understanding of the supernatural. After listening to her story, he warned her that she had crossed into the spirit's world the moment she looked directly into the woman's eyes. This spirit is restless, trapped in grief, he said, voice filled with concern. She seeks the living to replace what she has lost. Once she sees you, it's difficult to escape. The priest advised Priya to light a small lamp by her window every night, hoping the spirit would be drawn to the light instead of Priya. He also gave her a protective charm and warned her to never, under any circumstances, answer the woman's cries again. For a while, the lamp seemed to keep the woman's spirit at bay, and Priya finally found some peace. But the rains returned with a vengeance, heavier and colder than before, and the woman's crying grew louder and more insistent. Priya tried to ignore it, repeating the priest's warnings to herself, but the cries became harder to resist. They echoed in her head, each sob tearing at her nerves, filling her with a sense of guilt and dread. One night, unable to bear the crying any longer, Priya made the mistake of answering. "Who are you?" she whispered into the darkness, trembling. For a moment, there was silence. Then a soft, haunting voice replied, "I am the one who waits." Suddenly, the door to her bedroom slammed open, and Priya saw the woman standing in the doorway. Her wet hair hung over her face, and her pale, decayed hands clutched at the empty bundle in her arms. The woman's hollow eyes met Priya's, and a wave of despair washed over her, as if she could feel the woman's sorrow deep in her soul. Paralyzed with fear, Priya watched as the woman drifted closer, her figure flickering like a shadow cast by lightning. The woman reached out, and Priya felt the icy touch of death wrap around her heart. Her vision blurred, and she felt herself slipping away, sinking into the cold, endless rain. Just as Priya thought she'd be lost forever, a flash of light broke through the darkness. The priest had sensed her distress and arrived, chanting ancient prayers to drive away the spirit. The woman in white let out a terrifying scream and vanished into the shadows, leaving Priya gasping on the floor. But even as she lay there, she knew the haunting wasn't over. The priest looked at her solemnly and said, "She will not stop until she takes someone with her. Be careful, Priya. If you hear her again, do not answer." Days after her encounter with the priest, Priya couldn't shake the lingering cold that seemed to follow her wherever she went. The priest's words echoed in her mind. She will not stop until she takes someone with her. Priya knew that running wouldn't help, and if she wanted to end the nightmare, she needed to understand the spirit's story. She started researching the history of her neighborhood and came across an old newspaper archive online. Her heart skipped a beat as she found an article from decades ago detailing the story of a woman named Mira, who had drowned herself and her young child in a nearby river during a storm. Abandoned by her husband and rejected by society, Mira had lost everything she held dear. Her cries for help went unheard, and in her despair, she took both her and her child's lives. Locals believed that on stormy nights, her spirit wandered the streets, looking for her lost child or a soul to replace her own. Priya shivered as she read about others who claimed to have seen Mira on rainy nights. Those who looked directly at her or responded to her cries had vanished, just like Mira's child. One night, when a particularly fierce storm struck, Priya knew it was time to confront the spirit. Armed with the knowledge of Mira's tragic past, she prepared herself for what she feared would be her last encounter. She gathered a few items: a small candle, a photo of her own family for courage, and the protective charm given to her by the priest. As midnight approached, Priya lit the candle and placed it near her window, hoping it would ward off the spirit. But the rain was relentless, pounding against her window, and soon the familiar chilling sound of sobbing filled the room. This time, though, the cries were louder, filled with anger and anguish. "Why?" the voice whispered, echoing through her apartment. Priya took a deep breath, feeling the air grow colder. She whispered, "Mira, I know your story. I know your pain." The crying stopped, and an eerie silence filled the room. Priya felt a presence beside her, and when she turned, there stood the woman in white, drenched and hollow-eyed, clutching the empty bundle to her chest. Priya forced herself to speak. "I know you're looking for your child, but he's gone. You don't have to be alone anymore, Mira. You can find peace." For a brief moment, the woman's face softened, her sorrow visible beneath the decay. But the peace was fleeting, and her face twisted with rage. The walls of Priya's apartment began to shake, and the rain pounded louder than ever, deafeningly loud. The woman's voice filled the air, echoing with fury and despair. "He was mine. They took him from me." Priya clutched the charm tightly, but she knew it was not enough to stop Mira. In a final act of desperation, she took out the photo of her family and held it out to the spirit. "I know what it's like to lose people we love, but holding on to this pain will only keep you trapped." The woman's expression changed, a look of recognition flickering in her hollow eyes. Slowly she reached out a hand, as if to touch the photo. Her cold fingers brushed against Priya's hand, and in that moment, Priya felt a wave of overwhelming grief, followed by a sense of release. Mira's figure began to fade, her empty bundle slipping from her grasp. Her face softened, and for the first time Priya saw a hint of peace in her expression. As the woman's figure dissolved into mist, her final words lingered in the air. "Thank you." The storm quieted, and the room filled with a profound silence. Priya felt a weight lift from her shoulders, and for the first time in weeks, the air felt warm again. She knew Mira had finally found peace. The haunting was over, but Priya's life would never be the same. She moved out of the apartment shortly afterward, unable to forget the things she'd seen. But she carried with her a strange sense of connection to the spirit who had haunted her. and a deeper understanding of the pain that could keep someone trapped between life and death. From that day on, Priya made it a ritual to light a small candle whenever it rained, honoring the memory of the woman who had found peace in the storm.